So I'm going to be reading a section from The Crystal Pawn, and it's a little ways into the book. The characters have kind of gotten to the point where they've made a decision that they're going to be leaving the main party, but they haven't let people know about it yet. And they're riding through the woods, heading towards their first destination at a castle some distance away, and we're in the process of being on the road, and things don't go quite as planned. So we'll head into the section, and they're, like I said, they're on the road, they're on horseback, and they've been going through the forest for a period of time, and the day has been getting cloudy as it's gone on. The forest had become very dense since morning, and the further they traveled, the dimmer light filtered through became. By mid-morning, the road ahead was deep in shadows, and some of the horses had begun to shy, although nothing was seen along the trees. One tried to bolt, and its rider had a hard time getting it back under control. The guards looked about them, alert, but there was nothing tangible. Deirdre glanced up to look at the sky and noticed that some heavy clouds had come in, partially blocking the sun. The sunlight came and went at random intervals, and when it was covered, the air turned chill and unfriendly. "Gee," she said to Margaret, "what happened to the nice day that we're having?" A bird cried ahead of them, and Deirdre looked just in time to see a peregrine falcon wing its way through the trees. She suddenly recalled the vision in the cave and opened her mouth to yell a warning. Time slowed. From the depths of the woods, from the very shadows themselves, shapes formed and flowed, forming into inky black wolves that snarled silently through dim mouths at the guards and the other riders. Horses screamed as the black shapes with their ember-red eyes leapt for guard and servant alike. A woman behind them screamed, and Deirdre turned, panic riding in her, as one of the creatures leapt, taking the woman's head off in passing as it lunged at the nearby guard. Looking down, she saw Nurse standing by Vexenius's hooves as the stallion was backing and tensing to rear. The wolf's hackles were raised, and the lips pulled back in a terrifying snarl. Nurse hesitated a moment, if longer, before leaping into the middle of the shadow creatures. Horses milled about in confusion, and several bolted, taking some of the less experienced riders helplessly with them or dumping them bonelessly on the ground. "Hold tight," yelled Vexenius, and reared to his full height, lashing out at the nearest dark shape with his iron-shod hooves. To Deirdre's horror, the deadly blow passed right through the creature, and Vexenius, prepared for an impact, lost his balance and stumbled. He came down abruptly, throwing Deirdre forward onto his neck. She barely managed to twist her head to the side, smashing her ear instead of her nose into the crest of his neck, and felt her grip on the stallion's mane loosen. Her ear bloomed with warmth, and she frantically pushed herself upright, clutching at his coarse black mane. To her right, she saw Margaret's horse wrest control from her mistress and bolt, racing down the road as Margaret screamed. Deirdre looked to her left and saw Nurse racing from cover to cover, trying to draw the creatures away from the people who lay strewn upon the ground. More horses, mounted and not, streamed past her, lathered with foam, their eyes rolling wildly. Many of the guards were lying dead, and only the cart horses and wagons remained. Shrill neighs and yells of the frightened men told her that the carters were losing the fight to keep the panicked animals under control. Vexenius steadied and then reared suddenly as one of the carts thundered past, the wagon rocking perilously from side to side, the horses mad with fear. Deirdre clutched desperately at Vexenius's mane as the horse came down again, and had just started to move her hands tighter when the stallion reared up for a third time in a vain attempt to keep the shadow beasts from reaching her. Deirdre, her grip already loose, had no time to do more than claw uselessly at the stallion's lathered neck. Her hands, slick with sweat, found no purchase, and she began to fall. "Deirdre!" screamed Vexenius as he felt her leave the saddle. As she fell, a bright blue light appeared from the wood, borne by a huge beast who towered over the attackers. She saw the shadow wolves turn in eerie unison to face the newcomer, and glimpsed Nurse lying on the ground, red blood staining her white coat. Deirdre landed on the hardened ground of the road, and there was a sharp pain in her head. The world went black, and the last sound she heard was a guttural roar of rage, and then the world and all her worries were no longer her concern. She woke in the dark to the pain in her head and the smell of burning wood. A damp pressure on her eyes told her that a coarse, wet cloth was laid across them. From the way her head ached, she guessed that the cloth was more to keep her head from pounding than from any wound. She stirred, the bedding beneath her rustling and releasing the pungent, sweet smell that she had come to associate with the rushes at the keep. She moved her right hand slowly, feeling the coarse fibers of the blanket that covered her. It smelled a little like horse, but more of cow, a strong smell for one not used to being around farm animals, and she wondered muzzily who might be keeping cows in the middle of the forest. Lifting her hand from the blanket, she reached to touch the cloth over her eyes. There was a sound of motion nearby, and a large hand caught hers and placed it gently back on her chest. The hand covered hers for a moment, and then was withdrawn. "Not yet, huh?" she said, her voice sounding raspy and frighteningly weak to her ears. She licked her dry lips, realizing her thirst for the first time since waking. Her host made a low groan and moved slightly. She felt a hand slide gingerly under her head and raise it. A cup touched her lips, and she took small sips of water until she slaked her thirst. Gently, her head was lowered again, and she listened as her caretaker rose and moved a little ways away. She could feel that he was nearby, watching her, and it made her feel uncomfortable, yet safe at the same time. Before she could make up her mind which was better, she drifted off again. A bandage of some light material had replaced the cloth the next time she awoke. Her head was clearer, but ached abominably, making her glad for the darkness provided by the wrap. The fire threw off more heat than before, and she heard the thump of wood being added to the blaze. She managed with great effort to sit up a little on her elbows and waited for the pain to subside before sitting up a little more. A wall behind her provided a better support than her own muscles, and she heard her host breathing nearby, watching her intently. "I know you are here," she said. "I want to thank you for your help. My name is Deirdre." She heard a soft snort come from across the room, and after a moment of intense silence, broken only by the snap of the wood burning, she heard the sound of footsteps coming toward her. The smell of cow intensified as her benefactor knelt down near her, and she felt the flask pressed into her hands. She drank slowly, listening to the measured breathing, and began to get the distinct impression that whoever it was wasn't completely human. Male, yes. She got no feeling of feminine from the being, but not totally human. The smell of him still confused her, though, and brought to mind vague possibilities that she could not quite get a grip on. Something wasn't clicking, and she hurt too much to think about it just then. When she'd finished with the water, she gave the flask back and felt a piece of cooked meat pressed into her hand. The taste was wild and sharp, much like the venison that she had eaten the previous night in the wilderness. It was tough to chew, though satisfying, and just gnawing on the meat made her tired enough that she had to lay down again once more when she had finished. She felt the blanket being placed over her, and its warmth combined with that of the fire made her start to doze again. "Thank you," she murmured as she drifted off, and she fell asleep once more. The next few times that she awoke were much the same. She was handed food or water, and after eating would almost immediately fall asleep again. When needed, she let herself be guided to a crude privy and was left briefly so she could have her privacy. She began to get a feel for her host, quiet, sad, unable or unwilling to speak. He was ever gentle with her, and although he didn't talk, he was able to convey a great deal of meaning in every action. As she grew stronger, she told him a little bit about herself, about Nerfall, and how she'd come to be the Ivory Lady. She didn't tell him about her true home, but instead mentioned that she was from an unrecognized union suddenly discovered. None of this seemed to bring a response from her friend until she mentioned Darlena's death. She could tell, even without the benefit of vision, how agitated he had suddenly become, and his quick departure and distant roar of fury frightened her tremendously. Momentarily, she really thought about the size of his hands and wondered if he was just the gentle mute she had assumed. She lay back down then, not the least bit sleepy, and wondered, not for the first time, if Nersh and Vexanius were alive and looking for her. Had they perished after she had fallen, killed by the shadow wolves of the being with the glowing sword? How had she gotten away from the massacre, and where had her rescuer come from? Her head began to hurt again as she thought about all the possibilities. She tried to relax, waiting for the pain to subside. When she felt a little better, she gingerly felt her skull, probing at the lump and the bandaged gash. It was tender, but nowhere near as painful as it had been a couple of times when she had woken previously. Some time later, she heard her host's footsteps echoing on the stone of the floor. She turned to smile at him as he entered. "Hello," she said. "I'm sorry if I upset you. I didn't mean to." She heard him slow and his steps falter. He hesitantly approached the bed, and when she sat up to greet him, reaching out her hand as he sat down next to her. His hand met hers, and for a moment they simply sat there. She wondered again at the size of his hand and the way it enveloped her own. Then he lifted her hand towards him and let her touch his face. She could feel him tensing as her fingers made contact, but he made no move to stop her or turn away. Her fingers found fur, and she pulled back a bit in surprise. Fur! Tentatively, she made contact again, tracing the fur along the broad muzzle and up a gently angled brow. A thatch of coarse hair, slightly softer than Vexenius's, fell across his forehead, and she reached up further. Large cupped ears twitched when she moved them, and finally, what she had suspected but dared not voice even to herself, horns, massive curving horns that narrowed to a slight rounded point. He bent his head as she touched him, trembling slightly, but allowed her to discover the truth without hindrance. He took her free hand in one of his. His other hand moved to her head and began to unwrap the bandage that covered her eyes. She moved her hand from his face to her own, aiding in the removal, and blinking in the almost too bright light of the small fire. She took a moment, focusing on the face that she could now finally see. Black-furred, broad-browed, and intensely bovine, her host's face was less than a foot from her own. His muzzle narrowed towards the end, but flared wider where the nostrils sat above the lips that looked more mobile than those of a cow. Huge white horns tipped with black arched over almost comically large ears, and the thatch of hair fell between deep-set brown eyes that looked intelligently back into hers. In his eyes that turned, it was his eyes that turned her wariness to wonder, for they held no trace of menace or cruelty in their depths. They were sad, worried perhaps, but otherwise guileless and completely without the wicked cunning she would have suspected to find in the eyes of a minotaur.
Feedback is ubiquitous. It is literally all around us. It has quietly cemented itself into the daily nuances of every human interaction that it is now like air. We take it in subconsciously, and we have no idea how it moves throughout our bodies and influences our thoughts and behaviors. Feedback has played an integral role in shaping our performance, the communities in which we live, the policies we create, and our relationships with others. If used correctly, it is an effective tool that can be a catalyst for growth. If we want to influence behavior change, organizational change, systemic change, or societal change, we must improve our ability to deliver, receive, and process feedback. While feedback is a part of our everyday lives, many lack the necessary skills to leverage the feedback around them to facilitate the growth of themselves as well as the growth of others. This is not a judgment, it's simply a fact. Think about it. When were you taught how to effectively utilize feedback? Do you remember having a course in elementary school, junior high school, or college? What about when you got your first job? Were you trained at the church you joined or when you joined a local sports team? Chances are you've been given a lot of feedback. You've been given a lot of feedback and received a lot of feedback with little to no education or training on how to do so effectively. It's not your fault. Our society has not prioritized this as a critical skill or competency that should be sought after. Because of this, it makes engaging in a feedback conversation uncomfortable and even risky, as people recklessly fumble their way through sending and receiving information that can impact one's self-esteem, your relationships, your performance, and quite literally, your life. For the last 15 years, I have coached, mentored, and trained hundreds of individuals with an underlying focus on understanding the human experience of creating conditions that empower people to grow and live out their fullest potential. I have learned that no matter your age, race, gender identity, industry, management level, tenure, or relationship, feedback is central to the human experience. We may not want it, but we need it to grow. Poorly delivered feedback can hurt, and hurt people hurt people. This vicious cycle of poorly delivered feedback creates a mental and emotional obstacle that has the potential of preventing people from living out their full purpose in their lives. Without the skills to effectively leverage feedback, organizations will struggle to meet the needs of their customers and their employees. Without the skills to effectively leverage feedback, athletes might give up on pursuing their passion. Without the skills to effectively leverage feedback, leaders stop leading and start managing. Without the skills to effectively leverage feedback, students might believe that they're incapable of success. Without the skills to leverage feedback, long-term relationships can come to an end prematurely. Without the skills to effectively leverage feedback, you might stop believing in your ability to reach your dreams. I can teach you to effectively handle feedback, and all of the answers are literally in your hands. In this book, you're going to learn how to effectively deliver feedback to others, how to receive back from others, and the oh so important, how to process the internal narrative that gets attached to the feedback that you get in your everyday life. We will examine your attitude and your mindset around feedback, build your mental and emotional strength to handle the feedback, and provide you with strategies that will prevent you from becoming mentally and emotionally exhausted from feedback fatigue. Thanks for joining me on this journey. You are in for an exciting ride. Given the right conditions, a seed and a caterpillar can grow and become something new, right? In their newly evolved state, they experience the world differently, creating new meaning and purpose for their lives. Can you imagine speaking to a caterpillar about its potential to become a butterfly? Imagine the response you'd get when you told it about all the places it would fly in a single day, or their ability to collect and carry pollen to fruit, vegetables, and flowers that were critical to maintaining the ecosystem. I imagine that it would probably be difficult for that caterpillar to understand the vast possibilities of their potential, even if they saw other caterpillars transform right before their eyes. Can you imagine having a conversation with a seed right before it's planted? Can you imagine the response you'd probably receive when you told that little seed that it had the potential to become a 100-foot redwood tree that would provide oxygen needed to sustain human life, and that it could probably bear fruit that would go on to feed hundreds, if not thousands, of families? Do you think this tiny seed knows the potential it has within? When it comes to human potential, you can grow and become something new. While a seed requires soil and sunlight, human beings need feedback. Feedback is the gateway to helping you become an improved version of yourself and evolve in all the various aspects of the human experience. Human beings have a potential that is vast, infinite, and limitless, and unbounded by any social construct or expectation other than your own. Your potential is predicated on your ability to effectively receive, process, and apply the feedback that you've been given effectively. Hold on to the wrong feedback and you will limit your potential. Leverage the right feedback and you're on your way to discovering the best parts of yourself, opening up endless possibilities. What if I told you that you had the potential to become the most beloved musician in the world? Or that you'd eventually go on to find a cure for cancer, saving thousands of lives? Or that your commitment to social justice would create laws that ensured equity and justice for thousands of marginalized groups of people? Do you believe that you can accomplish those things? In many instances, the human potential goes undiscovered and unrealized simply because we are unaware that we have it and we're unsure how to tap into it. Feedback is a gateway to discovering your potential, and the feedback stored in your mind becomes the epicenter that guides your thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and the subsequent results that you achieve in your life. If you were to stop right now and examine your thinking, you'd have insight about where you are on your path towards your own full potential. Also, if you did that, you will more than likely trace your thoughts about your potential back to feedback that was given to you by yourself or others. Is your inability to effectively handle feedback limiting your potential? Is your inability to deliver feedback limiting someone else's potential? Once you develop what I call a feedback mentality, you will have the keys you need to unlock and unleash your full potential, but the potential of others as well. What comes to mind when you hear the word feedback? For some, it sparks feelings of curiosity, growth, gratitude. But for many, the word feedback conjures up feelings of anxiety, fear, and overall inadequacy. In the simplest terms, many people are afraid of feedback. Some are so afraid that they avoid it, they loathe giving it, and some have a hard time leveraging it. And some are even holding their breath while they're receiving it. How can one word hold so much power? How could one word tell your brain you need it, but in the same breath make you afraid of it? How can one word create such varied emotional responses that people even avoid using the word altogether to avoid triggering the flight or fight response? In order to understand the power of feedback, we must first start with the fundamental understanding of what it is. Feedback is information that gives us insight into how one perceives something or someone. It is the transmission of evaluative or corrective information about an action, an event, a process to the original controlling source. It is simply information that has the potential to influence future performance. The most powerful word in all of those definitions is information. Feedback is simply information. Information is defined as facts provided or learned about something or someone. Newton's third law of motion asserts that every action has a reaction. I believe that every behavior carries with it information that will trigger reaction from someone, either positive or negative. It is feedback that helps bring clarity and understanding about what we should or should not do, becoming a vital part of our decision-making process. The challenge with feedback is that many have a hard time identifying the feedback they receive if it's not packaged with the statement, "This is feedback." This means all of our other feedback really doesn't count in some people's minds. In my experience of leading and developing others, I can point to many occasions where employees said, "I wish I had more feedback," only to draw their attention to the numerous examples I provided where I've given guidance, redirection, correction, alternative perspectives, questions to ponder, affirmation, even admiration and encouragement. Many find themselves walking down feedback memory lane, pulling up documentation just to prove that they did indeed give feedback. Reviewing archived emails, text messages, or replaying back an entire conversation. When the feedback recipient finally makes the connection that they, did receive feedback, they give you that look or response that's equivalent to, "Oh yeah, I remember that now," leaving the person on the other side of the table feeling relieved. The conversation usually ends with the recipient alluding to something along the lines of, "You should have been more specific with your feedback." This reaction became a huge learning moment for me. There was a gap between the desire for feedback and an employee's ability to identify it. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ellie Atherton, a longtime hospice nurse and midwife to the dying. I've written 2 books in the last 8 months. The first one is Stepping Stones, Following a Pathway to the End of Life. These are simple stories from patients I cared for that were actually inspiring me to write a book because they were teaching me more about living than about dying. And the patients continually over the 2 decades, as I was sitting at the bedside with dying people, were asking the same questions, having the same worries, having the same fears. And I started journaling back in about 2003 and writing some of these stories down when I would get back into my car. And after a couple of years, I looked back at these stories and thought, these are great lessons that I should share, not just keep them to myself. I should share them with people. So it was reducing my fears of dying. It was opening up my eyes to spirituality in many different ways. And I thought, if people can read and learn in the privacy of their own home and have some emotion about the stories and not have to talk about it or talk about it if they want, I think that would be a gift. So I also didn't realize how cathartic the writing would be. I needed to write these stories and get them out of my system. I witnessed some beautiful things, I witnessed some sad moments, and the stories in the book are more heartwarming and compassionate. The really sad and struggling, suffering, someone else can write that book. I think we have enough of that in the world. So this book is intended to help people feel less fearful. And I had no idea last year when I put it out if anybody would read it and be interested. And surprisingly, in several months, 300 copies were gone. And people were saying, this book helped me. I can't believe I loved a book about dying so much, and I want more. So in comes book 2, More Stepping Stones, which is really, it's more stories, but it's more of what people were asking for, and they were asking for more about what happens in those last days of life, physically and spiritually. There's a lot of spiritual aspects to the second book, from a nature perspective, how animals seem to have an insight and intuition into when people are dying without getting a news flash or being told. Really fascinating stories. There's a whole chapter on last wishes and the things that people want. I would often say, is there anything you want before you die? And no one said $1 million, no one said a trip to Disney. They said some really cool things that will just surprise you. And beautiful little wishes, simple things. And again, it goes back to the lessons about what's really important in life. So it is my privilege to share these stories from these incredible people.
Hello everybody, my name is Michael D. Nato. I'm a local author. I write epic fantasy and some horror. Today I am at the inaugural event for the Goffstown Public Library. A bunch of authors that are all come here to show their hard work and effort and pray to God that, spread the word and get their names out there. Today I'm going to read a short piece from my first novel, the very first chapter. It was a blast to write. I enjoyed doing it. It's something that I'm very passionate about, and I'm glad that I found this later in life. So without further ado, To Live Again. He starts to come around, slowly at first, then more and more as memories start to filter into his mind. If only he could remember his name. The damp earth shifts as he flexes his arms, filling in the space where they were. Those elves buried him deep this time, very deep. Not at all like when his brothers and sisters had done it. He gathers his strength, pulling power from the soil packed in around him, and moves still further, little by little. He chuckles inwardly, thinking how impossible this would be if he were only human. But he isn't even close to human. He wonders briefly as he moves the heavy earth around him why he awoke. They surely had placed powerful wards around him to keep him slumbering and docile. Perhaps something had weakened them. He would find out soon enough. He pulls more power from the earth around him and swivels his head back and forth to dislodge more of the dirt. He strains his legs and pulls them up towards his body slowly as it fills in under him. When he finally feels the ground under him settle, he tests it gently by pushing down with his feet. It should hold. With one more draw of energy, from the very substance meant to be his prison, he builds power within himself, shoves down with his legs, and springs through the soil and roots towards the surface. He feels his legs break with the exertion, but shrugs off the pain. It'll heal. He bursts through the ground with a mighty explosion, and his unnatural body comes to rest waist deep. He immediately feels the wind whipping through his dirt-crusted hair, temporarily deafening him. With a thought, he shuts out the sound. He knows that his hearing will adjust soon. He doesn't dare open his eyes yet. Even moonlight could blind him at this point. Then the smell hits him. Nauseated, he refused to ignore this sensation. Instead, he revels in it. It must be early spring, his least favorite time of the year. He can smell the budding leaves, the healthy branches of the tree nearby, even the chill in the air that reminds him of a coming storm. It's all so disgusting. Life was springing up all around him and it made his skin crawl, but that would change soon. He braces his arms against the sod-covered ground and levers himself out of the gaping wound left in the earth. Already his legs are healing, bones knitting in a rapid pace that still amazes him to this day. Coughing rich dirt out of his long, unused mouth, he shakes the loose soil free of his long mane of black hair, opens his mud-caked black eyes, and takes a careful inventory of his appearance. His clothes have all but rotted away, except for the cloak bestowed upon him by his lord and sovereign on the day he was transformed into this vessel. Otherwise, he was in good shape for being in the ground for gods above know how long. His tall, 7-foot frame is thinner than he remembers, yet he feels strong. At least his long imprisonment hadn't taken that away. He opens his mind to the forest surrounding him, flexing his mental muscles, and tries to get a feel for this world around him. He can sense the smaller animals already fleeing for the farthest reaches of the wood, knowing instinctively that something unnatural has appeared. Smart creatures. He shakes his head, thinking that these tiny beings were smarter than some of the so-called greater races he had known in his many years. Farther and farther out his consciousness goes, seeing the slopes and valleys of this great wood. There. He spies a familiar landmark deep in a recess, almost covered by the forest floor. The sight staggers him. It would have taken the woods at least 200 years to grow over the statue he was seeing. He brings his sight back, memorizing the way there from his current location, and breathes deeply. Now he has a destination. Gathering his cloak around him, more out of habit than any need to shelter himself from the elements, he begins the long walk. He needs to move to work out any remaining kinks and limber up his muscles in case he needs them, but it may be a while before anyone comes for him. As he walks through the ancient, quiet forest, he notices that his other powers have not slackened in the slightest, though he has less than some of his brethren. Glancing over his broad shoulders, he notices that his passing still withers the small vegetation, not hardly enough to withstand his presence. He slows his pace and reaches out to brush his fingers against the bark of a mighty oak tree. The effect is immediate. The bark darkens, the blight spreading outward around the trunk and spiraling down towards the roots in the span of 2 slow steps. He hears the slight groan of the tree as its life slips away, rotting from within. He knows that in 20 paces the tree will collapse and decompose. He walks back to the gaping hole in the ground and looks down to where he was imprisoned for so long. He can now see the rotting roots that he broke through and feel the wound in the earth from his very presence. He smiles to himself. Still got it. He turns once more and restarts his journey. In 2 hours' time, he stands in front of the figure, or what is left of it anyway. Moss, earth, and roots engulf the massive marble sculpture, only revealing its huge face protruding from below. The statue of his lord and master was thrown down when they dragged him through here. He still remembers that fateful day, many years though it has been, as it was only yesterday. His name comes to him then, in a moment of clarity in a hectic morning. Darkrist. Now he feels complete. He is eager with hunger to walk the land, destroying the crops, animals, and even people with his touch, bringing his lord's will to the people of Lithanol, whether they want it or not. As he prepares for his journey, he wonders briefly who will oppose him this time. Will it be the elves again, throwing their human slaves at him in the hundreds? Or will his brothers and sisters come for him again? He was weakened the last time, or they never would have brought him low. No, this time he will know his limitations. Let them all come. He will see even his fellow incarnations lay at his feet, broken and bleeding, if it was the last thing he would do. Letting his sight spread out before him, Darkrist begins his walk, thinking how good it will feel to be back among the living once more. He spies a distant castle, hundreds of miles away, and knows instinctively that a ruler of people resides there. The incarnation of death laughs, his mighty voice echoing off the trees and scattering the few animals that had thought they were far enough away. No, this time he would not be sent into sleep again, the only prison that could ever hope to hold him. Yes, this time he would be victorious. This time he would bring suffering and decay to the world, and his master would be most pleased. Darkhrist moves towards a boulder blocking his path and places his hand upon it. In moments, it splits down the middle with a resounding crack that echoes through the solemn forest. Stepping over the rubble, he wonders if the elves are even in power still. That castle doesn't look anything like an elf would build. He needs to know more. He orients his sight once more and finds a new destination, his first stop among the people of this land, whatever they called it these days. The village seems like a frontier town, full of humans, no elves. Even better. He strides through the forest, and tuning his sight, he gauges the town to be about 80 miles that way.
So I'm going to read the very first opening of Mistletoe, Mobsters, and Mozzarella. This was a New York romance that I wrote last Christmas before COVID hit. So, advice for surviving in a big Italian family: never let them see you sweat. The moment I arrived at the deli, I knew something was wrong. The back door stood opened and unlocked, two things my obsessive-compulsive father made sure never happened. Since I was the first one to arrive every morning at the crack ass of creation and had to plug in the security code on the wall box in order to gain entry to the store, the door should have been locked and alarmed. My daily bread delivery, courtesy of my cousin Regina and her bakery, sat outside the door in a large wooden crate. After grabbing it, I hip-checked the door wide open. The second sign something was amiss were the lit lights in the entrance hallway. I arrived at work when it was still dark, no matter if it was daylight saving time or standard, and I routinely had to fumble to find the wall switch and illuminate the back end of the deli. Not today. And then there was the smell. I've been around raw meat my entire life. I grew up in my mother's kitchen, and I've worked in the delicatessen my father owns and operates since I was 10 years old. The aroma of animal blood is as recognizable to me as my mother's knockoff L'air de Temps. Although, admittedly, Mama's perfume smells way better. The scent filling the air this morning was wrong. Hello? Is someone here? An eerie sense of quiet surrounded me. I put the bread crate down on the linoleum floor and crept along the corridor leading to the front of the store. I slid my handle across the wall, my huge purse positioned in front of me like Wonder Woman's golden shield of protection. Being the oldest of 6 kids and the only girl in the mix, it takes a lot to scare me. My brothers are, each and every one of them, a pain in the ass to their cores, and I'd grown up the victim of their arguably stupid shenanigans too many times to count. Cooked linguine placed in my bed to look like worms, a farting cushion placed on my chair at the dinner table, toothpaste spread on my school lunch sandwich instead of peanut butter. More times than I could remember, one of them would hide in my closet, then jump out at me when I least expected. Anything and everything dumb and dumber they could think up to annoy me, they'd done, and still did to this day if they thought they could get away with it. Chronological maturity hadn't made its way to my brother's brains yet, and they all still acted like little boys when it came to infuriating me. This spine-tingling sense of unease rippling through me didn't feel like one of their usual pranks, though. But with my brothers, you just never know. I swear on all that's holy Giacomo I called out, naming the brother voted most likely to do something moronic. If this is some dumbass attempt to scare me, I'm going to make you suffer. I continued along the hallway, bypassed my father's office, then made my way to my own. Both doors were open, the rooms empty. The odor became more profound and ripe the closer I came to the front of the store. If you've ever left a piece of meat out on a counter all day to defrost it and forgotten about it until too late, you will recognize the odor. Vinny? Vito? Are you guys here? I called out. Silence came back at me. The overhead lights in the front of the store weren't on, so I couldn't see much of the store proper. A tiny bit of illumination filtered in through the front window, enough to make out the shapes of the little tables and metal chairs lining the seating area. A few years ago, my mother had had the idea to add them so people could come in on a lunch hour, order, then sit down for a few minutes to eat, instead of taking the food away with them. Turned out to be a good idea, too, because lunch hour business doubled by the end of the first month. It had been the one and only time my father had ever listened to one of my mother's business ideas. She never let him forget it either. When I'd left yesterday afternoon, the tables and chairs were all straight and set into their little spaces surrounding the window. Before he locked up at night, My father would upend the chairs onto the tables so he could sweep and then mop the floor. I sidled up to the back of the glass food display cases and looked right, then left. Nothing was wrong, but that itchy feeling hadn't left me yet. My fingers dragged along the wall until they came to the switch, then I threw the place into total light, something I never did at this hour of the morning. If anyone passing by on the streets saw the lights, they'd think we were open for business, which we weren't. Not for another 2 hours. In retrospect, I should never have come into the store after discovering the back door unlocked and standing open. Hindsight, as my Nonna Costanza used to say, is faciosi, fools, who think too much after the fact. She hadn't been wrong when she was alive, and she wasn't wrong now that she was dead. The seating section looked as if a bomb had exploded. Tables and chairs were scattered every which way, some overturned, others pushed up against the wall, a few lying on their sides. Glass, salt, and pepper shakers were smashed, their contents sprinkled across the floor in a dust storm of seasonings and glass shards embedded within the debris. The bread baskets were in a tangled heap on the floor alongside broken bottles and jars of stock items. The 6-foot evergreen tree I decorated and placed in front of the corner was on its side, colored glass balls shattered around it and scattered on the floor like Christmas confetti. I'd hung a sprig of mistletoe over the door on a lark, dangling it from the entrance bells that rang every time the door was opened. The bells were in a tangled heap next to the tree, and I didn't see the mistletoe anywhere. It was as if a detonation device had caused this. Then, at the very least, some kind of fight had occurred here during the night. My eyes darted across the mess. Fury replaced the tingle of uneasiness as I calculated how long this was going to take to clean it all up. I stopped short when I found the reason for the sickening smell. A puddle I knew instinctively was blood, splattered across a 2-foot by 2-foot area. It resembled an obscene Christmas Rorschach blotch. At this point, it was apparent my annoying brothers weren't attempting to play a sick joke on me. No, this was far too realistic for anything their man-child imaginations could concoct. I pulled my cell phone from my purse, fingered in 911, and then darted down the hallway, heading toward the back door I'd come through less than 5 minutes earlier. After speaking with the dispatcher, who assured me she was sending a unit to the store immediately and a caution to touch nothing, I hightailed it back out to the parking lot and called my father. That's it.
Hello, my name is Suzanne Eglinton. I am a romance writer, and also I write action adventures. And I'm here to talk to you about, first I'll cover my books. So my latest book is action adventure, and it's Pike Evans' novel. He is a third generation truck driver, transportation, and his whole career has been in the Army or has been in basic produce type of driving, and he needs to get out of that. So he has an adventure with Ghost, which is government operated systems that transport nuclear warheads. So he goes off on an adventure with that. And my second book that I want to talk to you about is High Priority, and this is about a organ donor transport service. And Tiffany Chandler is she is a rich girl that is balking her upbringing. So she takes a job with a armored transportation service.
Hello, I'm Tony Trembling. I'm a resident of Goffstown, and I've written several books. Seeds of Nightmares, which is a short story book that has several stories that are set in Goffstown. I've also written one called Blue Stars, again several stories, and some of those also take place in Goffstown. But I'm primarily known for and proud of The Moore House, which is a novel that is set in Goffstown. It was a finalist from the Bram Stoker Awards, and what they do is they look at horror books from all over the country, all over the world, and they pick the best 5 books. And The Moore House was picked as one of the 5 books, so I made the finalists, and very proud of that. The new book I have coming out in October is called Do Not Weep for Me. I'm going to read a little bit of it, but Do Not Weep for Me It's sort of a follow-up to the Moore House. It has some of the same characters, and it's also set in Goffstown. So here I go. Paul Lane glanced at the thermometer on his front porch. 74 degrees. And then, cup of coffee in hand, stood on the concrete steps. He noted the thick cloud cover. Its gray hue muted the sunshine, dulling the vibrant palette of the season. He looked down and frowned. The grass covering his yard looked different. The stiff, neatly trimmed blades rested limply on the topsoil. The deep green shamrock green had faded, its tips tinged with yellow. It was too tired looking for mid-June. The flowers on the Rose of Sharon hedge, so proud yesterday, were now listless. Their parade of bright red blossoms absorbed the muted sunlight and reflected a color more akin to copper than candy apple. The neighborhood had taken on a dingy appearance. It was as if the brick, aluminum, and vinyl siding facades of the homes had bathed in a layer of dust. Not one of the new cars screamed, "Look at me!" Their wax jobs lacked sparkle, their chromes trimmed dull. Something was off. People in this neighborhood had pride. They were not known for neglecting their property. "Daddy!" The call broke his concentration. "Yes, Cindy? Can I play on the swing for a few minutes before you take me to school?" Paul didn't answer. There was a heaviness to the area, and he couldn't put his finger on it. The atmosphere, it had weight. Not only was it oppressive, it was concerning in a way that defied easy description. He caught sight of Sheila White, the neighbor across the street, as she retrieved the daily newspaper from the box at the end of her driveway. The woman waved to him, and he waved back. She was a fine-looking woman, and knew it. He smiled when she stopped a few feet from her front door and wiggled her ass before stepping back inside. Paul's wife had been dead for 4 years now, but that didn't mean he was. Though Sheila often flirted with him, she was off limits. He and her husband Tom were good friends, and he would never betray that trust. Still, she did brighten Paul's mood on occasion. "Daddy, can I?" "Huh?" He had forgotten about Cindy. "Yeah, sure, honey. Stay in the back. I'll come get you when it's time to leave." "You want to eat anything before you have breakfast at daycare?" "No, I'm okay. Can you push me?" He chuckled. "Sure, give me a minute to bring my stuff to the car. I'll be right out." "Thanks, Daddy." She gave him a quick hug and ran back inside. He followed her in, and after chugging his coffee, Paul draped his suit coat over his arm and grabbed his briefcase and backpack. There was a thud, confirming his daughter had gone through the back door to the swing set. The forecast promised clear weather, so he left his car in the driveway overnight. He walked to the Lexus with thoughts of that morning's meeting he had planned with his company's engineers. He made a mental note to review cost analysis on the retrofit of the South Willow Street Mall in Manchester. Lost in thought, he threw his suit coat and briefcase into the rear seat. After shutting the door, he made an effort to clear his head and attend to Cindy. He walked past an area of tall pines and scrub that marked the property line on the right side of his house. When he was about to turn the corner to the backyard, he slowed. This doesn't feel right. He should have heard squeaks from the rusty chains attached to the joints at the top of the swing set. He'd meant to oil them, but never found the time. The squeaks were annoyingly loud. You could hear them from 20 feet away. His back stiffened and he hurried his pace. She could be just sitting and not swinging. Maybe she went back into the house. God, please, don't let me have screwed up. He rounded the corner. The swing was empty. Cindy was nowhere in sight.